Gulf, as grave as it is, also offers a rare opportunity to move toward an historic period of cooperation. Out of these troubled times, our fifth objective, a new world order, can emerge.
People are still bewildered by what happened on September 11th, 2001. This brief study cross-examines the mechanics, the men involved, and the motives for what happened on that day. Most people assume that Flight 93 was crashed by its passengers after they overtook the terrorists who controlled it. After all, it left a scar in the earth. Here's the problem. According to a USGS aerial survey, that scar existed in 1994 or earlier. At this point, we have two choices. We can choose to believe that a full-sized airliner being fought over can crash into topsoil in precise alignment with a pre-existing scar, leaving that scar relatively intact. We can also choose to believe that only part of the plane landed within that scar. The first option would violate the patterns of hundreds of airplane crashes over decades. The second option forces us to ask whether pieces of the plane were found in other locations. Indeed, this is the case. Small pieces of the plane were spread out over a debris field several miles long. This forces us to ask how the plane disintegrated. According to retired Colonel Don de Grand Pré, it was shot down by a member of the Air Force. We have since learned the probable name of the pilot who eliminated Flight 93. Lieutenant Colonel Rick Gibney was the only pilot in the United States Air Force to be given an award in secret for his actions on a special mission on 9/11. Most people assume that Flight 77 struck the Pentagon with no warning by a crack pilot. In recorded testimony before the 9/11 Commission, then Transportation Secretary Norman Mineta recalled what he witnessed in the Presidential Command Center below the White House.
During the time that the airplane coming in to the Pentagon, there was a young man who would come in and say to the Vice President, the plane is 50 miles out, the plane is 30 miles out. And when it got down to the plane is 10 miles out, the young man also said to the Vice President, do the orders still stand? And the Vice President turned and whipped his neck around and said, of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary?
This testimony proves that the Vice President was aware that something was approaching the Pentagon. Hani Hannour is alleged to have hijacked Flight 77 and flown it into the Pentagon. Here's the problem. The flight parameters for Flight 77, obtained under the Freedom of Information Act from the National Transportation Safety Board, indicate that the flight deck door remained closed once the plane was in flight. The mid-air hijacking of Flight 77 could not have taken place if the cockpit door never opened. One of the popular myths of 9/11 is that the Twin Towers were towering infernos. If that's true, then people wouldn't have been told to return to work in the South Tower.
In the neighboring South Tower, people are also evacuating, but an announcement over the PA system tells workers their building is secure and they can return to their desks, an announcement that will soon have tragic consequences.
If the towers were towering infernos, then the Battalion 7 chief would have never been able to make it to the 78th floor and say,
We got tanks, isolated pockets of fire. We should be able to knock it down with 2 lines. Where you know that? 78th floor, numerous 1045 coal lines.
If the tower fires were melting steel columns, then Edna Sintron wouldn't have been able to wave from the plane impact zone with her light pants not even singed. The collapse of Building 7 forces us to consider other possibilities for the collapse of the Twin Towers. Here's the problem. Building 7 was not hit by a plane and not splashed with burning jet fuel, yet at 5:20 p.m. on September 11th, Building 7 fell exactly like the Twin Towers did.
For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
The most logical explanation for the building collapses on September 11th is the most outrageous: through the use of explosives. All explosives leave residues. A 2009 peer-reviewed scientific paper has been published in the Open Chemical Physics Journal, proving that explosive residues of specialized thermite, which could only have been made in advanced military labs, were found in preserved dust samples from the remains of the buildings. Jet fuel is premium-grade kerosene which cannot melt steel. Thermite is a mixture of iron oxide and aluminum. When ignited, it burns at over 2,500 degrees Celsius to instantly liquefy steel. There is plenty of evidence that thermite was used on that day and that it kept reacting for weeks after the buildings collapsed.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails, like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like lava.
A volcano.
In addition to thermite, 2 other types of explosives were used to level 3 buildings on 9/11.
The job of the shape charge is to cut steel H-beams.
The way we do this is by cutting the beam at an angle, which, through a series of beams cut at the same angle, will tend to make the building shift over and walk.
Shape charges were used to slice through posts at an angle, not straight across, for a reason.
The 4-1 should have taken check for a couple of companies that they were leaving back.
Go against another.
Keep your eye on that building as they coming down.
The building is about to blow up. Move it back. You want to call your mother or something?
You gotta get back up here.
We made it outside. We made it about a block.
We made it at least 2 blocks, and we started running. Floor by floor, instead of popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Yeah,
if they were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
Based on the evidence, the final roll sequences after pre-weakening with thermite and shape charges was most likely done with nuclear explosives. Don't think of Hiroshima. If the United States Army was loading nuclear shells by hand into howitzers 50 years ago, what do you think is available in the 21st century? The evidence for the use of nuclear explosives on 9/11 is substantial. A government report tried to spin the appearance of the radioactive isotope tritium at ground zero in concentrations dozens of times higher than the surrounding area. Hundreds of cars at ground zero burst into flames from the inside out. This is explained with the characteristic electromagnetic pulse of nuclear explosions overloading the vehicle's electronics, causing the vehicles to ignite. It would be foolish to conclude that aviation-grade kerosene would cause this kind of selective damage while leaving truckloads of loose paper around the site untouched. Toxic fumes produced by fires from the continuously reacting thermite and radiation from the final roll sequences explain why 7 out of 10 people with significant exposure to ground zero are dying from a host of illnesses. If explosives were used to destroy buildings on 9/11, they would have had to be placed in the buildings. This is made easier when there was an unprecedented power down in the World Trade Center complex for alleged electronic upgrades on the weekend before September 11, 2001. Is it just a coincidence that the president's brother, Marvin Bush, was on the board of directors for the firm providing security at the World Trade Center? Is it also a coincidence that the firm's contract with the World Trade Center ended on September 10th, 2001? The so-called terrorists who attacked America without warning were trained and lived at U.S. military bases. The radical Islamic terrorists of 9/11 got drunk in a Florida bar, paying for their drinks with a wad of cash. Some of the terrorists who died in 9/11 have turned up alive and well. The 9/11 terrorists list has not been updated. Documents reveal that Osama's CIA codename was Tim Osman. This leads us back to Zbigniew Brzezinski because he created the Mujahideen in the late 1970s, which were later renamed Al-Qaeda. The people of Pakistan know what the US will never admit to, that Osama bin Laden is a CIA asset.
Who is Osama bin Laden? He's just a character created by America.
Well, actually, 98% of Pakistan would probably follow along the same line. They believe that Osama is basically a CIA agent who is working undercover to put a bad image of Islam.
Really?
You know, that land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
This is assuming that Osama is still alive and that the conveniently timed release of new Osama recordings aren't faked. This brings us to why 9/11 occurred. James R. Bath met George W. Bush during their time at the Texas Air National Guard. Both were kicked out for being AWOL. Through a trust agreement created in July 1976, James Bath was authorized to invest money from Salem bin Laden, father of Osama bin Laden. This was at the time when George Bush Sr. was director of the CIA. 3 years later, James Bath bought 25,000 shares in Arbusto 79 Limited, George Bush Jr.'s oil company. The Bushes do business with the bin Ladens. The Saudi bin Laden Group makes its money from being the main construction conglomerate of the House of Saud. The Saudis make their money from supplying oil to America to create an artificial demand for the US dollar. Oil, the dollar, and war, the House of Saud, the House of Bush, and the House of bin Laden are all connected. George Bush Sr. was a member of the Carlyle Group, a venture capital firm heavily invested in arms sales. On the morning of September 11, 2001, George H.W. Bush was present when the Carlyle Group hosted a conference at a Washington hotel. Among the guests of honor was a valued investor, Shafiq bin Laden, brother to Osama. Operation Northwoods is the name of a top-secret report produced in 1962 by the highest-ranking military officer in the United States. This report remained classified for nearly 40 years, and for good reason. It suggested that the United States military should attack America under a system of pretexts. The attack would then be blamed on Cuba as an excuse to invade Cuba. The details of this report are staggering. Items inside a military base could be blown up and burnt. A ship at harbor could be sabotaged by starting large fires with naphthalene. Funerals for mock victims could be conducted. A modified military plane could be substituted for a civilian plane and loaded with passengers under carefully prepared aliases. The military aircraft would then be converted to a drone. The United States military planned to attack America in 1962 using remote-controlled aircraft to justify invading Cuba. Fast forward to 9/11. Because the cockpit door of Flight 77 never opened in flight, this is exactly what happened on 9/11. Now you can never say they'd never think of that. They thought of that in 1962. They thought about it again in 2001. The Project for a New American Century is a neoconservative think tank. Some of its members are the most powerful people in the United States. In a report dated September 2000, 1 year before 9/11, This group wanted to turn the United States military into a vehicle of global domination. You may doubt this interpretation until you turn to page 60. Here, we read that advanced forms of biological warfare that can target specific genotypes may transform biological warfare from the realm of terror to a politically useful tool. This report noted that this transformation would trouble American allies and would take a long time, absent a catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. The goal of the war on terror is to make loads of money and to accelerate the next great dialectical war. Insurgents keep being captured, but some of them turn out to be MI5 agents. Over 160,000 soldiers and 180,000 civilians and mercenaries are being used to fight 100 Al-Qaeda soldiers. Members of Al-Qaeda are being trained at US military bases. Opium is flowing from Afghanistan. The lies are so thick that bricks of cash are being given out to soldiers to keep them quiet. The Illuminati do not want peace. They want more wars.
I met Rockefeller through a female attorney I knew, and I met him and I liked him, and he was a very, very smart man. He's the one who told me 11 months before 9/11 ever happened that there was going to be an event. Never told me what the event was going to be, but there was going to be an event, and out of that event, we were going to invade Afghanistan to run pipelines from the Caspian Sea. We were going to invade Iraq, to take over the oil fields, establish a base in the Middle East, and make it all part of the New World Order. And sure enough, later, 9/11 happened. And I remember he was telling me how you're going to see soldiers looking in caves for people in Afghanistan and Pakistan and all these places. And there's going to be this war on terror, which is no real enemy. And the whole thing is a giant hoax, but it's a way for the government to take over the American people. And he said the end goal is to get everybody chipped, to control the whole society, to have the bankers, the elite people, the bankers and some governor controlling the world.
In earlier times, it was easier to control 1 million people than physically to kill 1 million people. Today, it is infinitely easier to kill 1 million people than to control 1 million people. It is easier to kill than to control.
He has proven to be an outstanding friend and somebody who I've learned an immense amount from. And for him to support me in this campaign and then be willing to come out here to Iowa is a testimony to his generosity. So if everybody could please give Dr. Brzezinski